Bruce Lee wasn't in the mood to impress anyone in Los Angeles that night. He could have smiled, signed autographs, fit into Hollywood's cool circle, but he closed the door to the training hall and silenced the room, like a director saying quiet on set before a scene begins. The only difference was that there were no cameras, and what was about to happen shouldn't even be recorded. Bruce folded his hands, rolled his neck, and for a second didn't show off, just focused. Then Steve McQueen walked in, king of cool, the man whose presence made people adjust their posture. Steve gave a half smile, the kind of smile that becomes legendary in interviews, but Bruce didn't even acknowledge it. Bruce stood straight up to him, eyes a calmness only dangerous people possess, and uttered the kind of line that would strike a chord with someone like Steve's. "Here, you're not the star. Here, you're the student." Steve's smile froze slightly. Bruce threw a small circle on the floor and quietly said, "There's only one rule in this circle." Steve asked, "Which one?" Bruce replied, "Ego not allowed." And then Bruce gave the warning that makes this story controversial. The moment you feel win, the session ends there. Now the real question is this: could a man like Steve McQueen, whose career was based on control and dominance, follow Bruce Lee's rule? Or did Steve realize that night, for the first time, that he wasn't fighting a man, but his own image? Steve McQueen observed that circle and realized for the first time that this wasn't a normal Hollywood lesson, because Bruce Lee's style was never normal. Bruce's demeanor was as if he had come into the room not to prove himself, but to get a reality check. The story that brought Steve to Bruce had exactly the same vibe. In the Los Angeles martial arts scene of that time, everyone was posing as a teacher, everyone was selling the story of being a black belt, and the actors only needed poses and safe choreography. But Steve McQueen's problem was that he didn't just want to act, he wanted to feel real. He wanted to not fake the punches he threw in front of the camera. Steve had a cool image, but beneath that coolness lay a restless competitiveness, a passion for racing, an addiction to risk, and a silent fear that people might mistake him for just an actor. So Steve chose martial arts not as a fashion, but as a form of identity. And when he heard Bruce Lee's name, from people, in gyms, in whispers, he heard something else along with the name. Bruce's training breaks the ego. This line wouldn't have gone down well in Hollywood, because Hollywood runs on ego. But that's what attracted Steve, because he was already king in his own world. Now he wanted to be king in his own body and mind. People used to say about Bruce that he didn't just teach his students moves, he exposed their habits, how they get angry, when they panic, when they go into proving mode. And for Steve McQueen, proving mode was the normal state. Whether there was a camera or not, Steve's inner engine ran on competition. Bruce would have known all this beforehand, because Bruce's eyes didn't just pick up on stances, they picked up on a person's story. So when Steve came into the room, Bruce avoided small talk, because small talk comforts the ego, and Bruce didn't keep the ego comfortable. This was the same Bruce who shocked people not just with speed, but with clarity. Less talk, more to the point. And when he said no ego, he was actually saying no excuses. Steve might have liked this line publicly, but privately it became an insult. Because the more powerful you are, the smarter your ego becomes. It convinces you that you're calm when you're simply afraid of losing control. Bruce read this very thing in Steve, Steve's cool mask, and behind that mask, an obsession with control. Steve's style was hard, direct, and masculine. Bruce's style seemed soft, but beneath the softness lay a blade, angles, timing, and that broken rhythm that confuses the opponent. The first time Steve saw Bruce perform live, he might have thought he was fast, but being fast is one thing, and being unreadable is another. Bruce was unreadable, and being unreadable triggers the ego the most, because the ego needs control. Now imagine a guy like Steve McQueen, with people following him on set, directors adjusting to him, and scenes changing according to his mood. Now he's in a room where Bruce decides the rules, and Bruce's first rule turns out to be Steve's favorite thing: I have to win. Bruce had Steve step into the circle, and the concept of the circle was simple: boundaries. Bruce was saying, your role here is fixed. This psychologically irritated Steve, because stars don't set boundaries. Boundaries are set for them. Steve took the step anyway, because not taking the step would undermine his masculinity, and Bruce also noticed that Steve was taking the step not with acceptance, but with challenge. Bruce offered Steve gloves, but Steve took them a little late, as if to say, I'm not nervous. Bruce didn't react at all, because Bruce understood the drama of posture. He simply kept his breathing steady, shoulders loose, eyes relaxed, and a presence so calm the person in front of him felt louder. The setting that night was also deliberately simple. No crowd, no students, no applause, just floor mats and the kind of light that makes you hear your heartbeat. Bruce briefed Steve, light contact, but the light inside Steve could sometimes grow heavy, and Bruce had already given a warning line for this. The moment you feel win, the session ends right here. Steve could find this line fair, but also unfair, because it meant that Bruce was going to referee your emotions, and you couldn't judge your own. Steve asked, so what should I focus on? Bruce said, observe. Steve must have thought, I don't observe, I attack. But he didn't say anything. He just took a stance, weight slightly forward, jaw set, eyes locked. Bruce also took a stance, but there was no tension in that stance. It was almost casual, as if he had come to understand, not to fight. And then came the moment where the build-up pays off. Bruce let Steve make the first move, because Bruce wanted to see Steve's ego live. And when Steve took his first step, there was a hidden sentence in that step: let's see if you're real. Bruce heard that sentence wordlessly and answered with his eyes, I'm being real. You decide now whether you're honest or not. At this point, the session wasn't just sparring. It became a test of Steve, a test of the rules, and most of all, a test of the image that Steve McQueen had sold to the world. Continue? When Bruce Lee gave Steve McQueen the first move, it wasn't just a courtesy, it was a trap. Because Bruce knew that when the king of cool takes his first step, that step isn't just footwork, it's a statement: I'm in control. Steve shifted his weight forward, shoulders tight, and he executed a quick jab-like motion that might seem real to an actor, but for Bruce, the motion was as readable as someone reading a script aloud. Bruce didn't block the punch. Bruce changed angle, half step, almost invisible, and Steve's punch vanished into thin air, as if its power hadn't been met with anything. Steve instantly threw a second punch, this time faster, but Bruce wasn't where Steve thought he was. Bruce's torso leaned, his feet glided, and for the first time, Steve had the feeling that rarely comes to any star: I'm late. Bruce still didn't touch Steve, because Bruce's goal wasn't to hit. Bruce's goal was to make Steve hear the sound of his own intensity. Steve tried to hide his frustration behind a smile, the same half-smile that's charming in interviews, but in the ring, that smile is sometimes a mask of panic. Bruce ignored that smile and said in a soft tone, relax. Steve understood relax to mean become weak, so he didn't relax, he pushed harder. In the third exchange, Steve threw a heavier straight. Now the ego was coming out of the acting, and Bruce tagged Steve lightly for the first time, just a feather touch, like someone reminding you, I'm here. Steve's body froze for a second, because that touch became an insult. So easily? Bruce gave another light tag, then another. 3 touches so quickly that Steve couldn't tell if they were hits or warnings. And that's where Bruce's rule came into effect, because when your mind can't calculate, your ego compensates. Steve doubled the speed, then force, then forward pressure, and under that pressure, that I have to win heat began to appear. Bruce immediately raised his hand, stopped sparring, absolutely cold, absolutely final, and said, stop. Steve tried to control his breathing, but his chest had become slightly heavy. Bruce looked at him and said, "It's exactly what I said." Steve asked, "What?" Bruce said a line that allegedly irritated Steve the most. "You're not learning, you're proving." Steve replied, "I'm just adding intensity." Bruce said, "Not intensity, ego." For Steve, this word was an ego insult, because Steve considered his life to be disciplined, but Bruce knew the difference between discipline and ego. Discipline is quiet, ego is loud. Bruce brought Steve back to the center of the circle and said softly, "Look, your body is strong, your mind is fast, but your biggest problem is that you're judging every second how I look." Steve narrowed his eyes as if to say, "I'm a movie star, obviously." But Bruce sharpened the point. "You can't be cool here. Trying to be cool stiffens you. Stiffness makes you predictable."
Steve consciously loosened his shoulders for the first time, as if realizing that his posture had become armor. Bruce didn't waste the moment, because Bruce's license landed at perfect timing. Bruce said, "I don't want to hurt you. I want to show you your habits." Steve said in a dry tone, "And my habit?" Bruce said, "Addiction to control." Steve laughed lightly, but the laughter wasn't fun. It was defense. Bruce restarted the sparring again, but this time Bruce gave Steve an instruction that was technically simple, yet psychologically brutal. You will not make the first move. You will only respond. For Steve, it was punishment, because dominant people initiate. Responding made him feel weak. Steve tried again, but his body held impatience. Bruce made a slow feint. Steve bit, and Bruce didn't punish the bite, just exposed it. A light tag, then a step out. Steve bit again, then a tag, then a step out. Every time Steve thought, "Now I'll catch and lunge," and every time Bruce got ahead of his thoughts. Now Bruce's touches weren't hits, they were messages, as if Bruce were saying, "Your mind decides first, then your body follows, and I'm reading your decision." Steve's face turned a little red, not because he was tired, but because he was being read. Hollywood's king of cool suddenly felt like someone was peeking under his mask. Steve launched another aggressive burst, 3 fast punches, a push, a step in, and that was the moment Bruce's rule was broken again. Bruce stopped again, this time more direct. "Boss," Steve said irritably, "why do you stop me every time?" Bruce said calmly, "Because you always bring the same thing." Steve asked, "What thing?" Bruce said, "Winning." Steve said, "Sparring is all about winning." Bruce tilted his head slightly, like a teacher looking at a student and deciding whether to tell the truth. And then Bruce uttered the line that could become the backbone of this video. "Winning isn't about sparring. Sparring reveals your control, or your ego." Steve fell silent for a second and looked at Bruce, and reportedly in that second, the cool inside Steve wobbled, because Steve realized for the first time that the opponent here isn't Bruce, but his own reflex. When things get out of control, I get angry. When I get angry, I get force. When I get force, I become predictable. Bruce had Steve step back into the circle and quietly said, "Now, for the last time, your target isn't to hit me. Your target is to feel that heat inside you, and yet remain soft." Steve set his jaw, determination in his eyes, but this time that determination carried a new fear, fear of being seen. Bruce sensed that fear and said just one sentence, almost like a whisper, "If you can't follow the rules, you'll never be free." Continue? When Steve heard "stay soft," his face took on an expression for a second that the camera never captures, because the camera only romanticizes confidence, not confusion. For Steve McQueen, softness meant losing control, and losing control was against his entire persona. But for Bruce Lee, softness was the highest form of control, because a man who can hit while staying soft is not a slave to panic. Bruce reset his stance, shoulders loose, chin natural, and no rush in the eyes at all. This calm was not the calm that slow people have. It was the calm that comes before lightning. Steve breathed in, then out, and this time he genuinely tried not to initiate, just to respond. But a hidden engine within his body had already started. Bruce made a light feint, just a shoulder drop, a toe shift, and Steve's reflex almost fired. Then he stopped himself. It was that micro moment where Bruce knew Steve got the rule, but couldn't yet follow. Bruce kept his voice very low. "Good. Now feel that heat, and don't let that heat drive you." Steve nodded, but more than the nod, there was a challenge in his eyes, as if he was saying, "I'll try, but I can't change my nature." Sparring restarted, and this time Bruce didn't chase Steve. Bruce invited him. Bruce's footwork was small, economical, as if he was folding space, and Steve's footwork was broad, heavy, as if he wanted to dominate space. When Steve took a forward step, Bruce cut the angle. When Steve followed the cut, Bruce broke the rhythm. And when Steve finally thought he was getting the timing, Bruce gave Steve a soft tap on the chest, not at all disrespectful, but humiliatingly easy. A spark ignited within Steve, and that spark was ego. Steve suppressed a laugh to protect his mask. Okay, but the air within the laugh was tight, not relaxed. Bruce didn't narrow his eyes, just observed, because Bruce's most dangerous weapon was his observation. Steve threw another quick combination, 2 hands, then a push in. And this time Bruce didn't just evade, he intercepted. A half step in, a light sharp parry, and Steve's balance was off for a fraction of a second, as if the floor had betrayed him.
And when the balance is off, a fighter's ego instantly begins to fix itself. Steve added force. Bruce stiffened without absorbing the force. Steve applied pressure, Bruce redirected it. And that's when Steve realized the most annoying truth. Bruce wasn't fighting him, Bruce was managing him. Stars don't like being managed because the nature of stars is to dominate, and Steve's nature was doubly dominating. Bruce lightly tagged again, one on the cheek, one on the shoulder, and for the first time, Steve felt the heat of panic seep into his cool self. He told himself, "Calm." But with calm, his mind added another sentence, "I can't look weak in front of this guy." As soon as Bruce read this sentence, he simplified sparring, and simplicity became the ultimate cruelty. Bruce showed Steve only one pattern: feint, angle, touch, out. Feint, angle, touch, out. Every time Steve was late, every time Steve was in chase mode, every time Steve put in a little more effort, and more effort meant more tension. Steve thought he would now cover the gap with intensity, but Bruce didn't consider intensity as fuel. Bruce considered intensity as noise. Steve once made a proper step-in, shoulder drive, and Bruce sidestepped at the very last moment, sending Steve into empty space. Steve's foot didn't slip, but his pride did. And that slip was so silent only 2 people could hear it, Steve and Bruce. Steve turned instantly, and this time his punch wasn't acting, it was personal, because when someone's pride is hurt, the punch hits the target, not the humiliation. Bruce didn't block the punch, Bruce read the punch, and as soon as he read it, he called "Stop," very sharp, "Boss." Steve's chest rose and fell, now with a little speed, and he almost snapped. "What am I doing wrong?" Bruce said without delay, "You want to win." Steve said, "Obviously." Bruce replied simply, "That's your problem." Steve's face tightened as this line challenged his hero image. Bruce didn't ask Steve to sit on the floor again, didn't lecture him, just gave a simple demonstration. Bruce held out his hand. "Hold my wrist." Steve held it, a strong grip, controlled, and Bruce said, "Now hold me, full." Steve added force, and Bruce freed his wrist in a second without struggle, without drama, just with angle and relaxation. Steve said in shock, "How?" Bruce said, "You're hard, that's why you're readable." Steve grabbed it again, this time tighter, and Bruce left again, and each time Bruce left, Bruce's expression the same, calm. To Steve, this was a calm insult, because calm meant Bruce was mentally in charge. Bruce then said the line that supposedly struck Steve deeply. "You mistake control for strength. I mistake control for freedom." Steve asked, "Freedom?" Bruce said, "Freedom from proving." Steve breathed out as if irritated by his own voice. "So what do you want, for me to go completely soft?" Bruce said,
not soft, empty. Steve looked confused, and Bruce explained, empty means your next move doesn't dictate your image. Your next move dictates the situation. Steve nodded, but there was still resistance within the nod. Sparring resumed, and this time Bruce gave Steve one last test. I'm going to give you an opening. You don't jump on that opening. Steve said, why? Bruce said, because your ego jumps on openings. Your mind reads openings. Bruce deliberately let his guard down, a false invitation, and Steve actually resisted for the first time. He didn't jump. Bruce gave a soft smile, very slight, as if to say, now you understand. But the moment didn't last long, because Steve's ego was smart. He thought, if I'm resisting, I'm already winning. And that was the twist. Steve had turned even following the rules into a competition. Bruce tagged Steve that very second. Simple as that, and then stopped. Steve laughed almost frustratedly. Now what? Bruce said, see? You've even turned the rules into a trophy. For a second, shame and anger crossed Steve's face, a dangerous combo, and Bruce said in a very low voice, that's one rule you can't follow, Steve. You can't stop winning. After that line, the room fell silent, heavy, and Steve McQueen's cool mask cracked slightly as he realized for the first time that Bruce Lee wasn't just touching his body, but his mind. Continue? When Steve McQueen heard, you even made the rule a trophy, his inner engine grew louder, but this time the loudness wasn't in his punches, but in his silence. It was the kind of silence that comes only when someone wants to defend themselves, but their words betray them. Bruce Lee didn't break that silence because Bruce knew that some people feel the most pain when they start to hear their own voice. Steve shrugged a little, as if to say, fine, and asked, so you want me to be completely emotionless? Bruce replied simply, don't be emotionless, don't be choiceless.
Steve both understood the line and didn't understand it. He understood Bruce was talking about control, but Steve's point was that his life was a test of control. If I'm in control, I'm superior. If I'm superior, I'm safe. Bruce read this formula in his eyes, so he set up a test that was not just a test of technique, but a lie detector of ego. Bruce said, now, one last round. Steve immediately straightened his posture as if he was serious now, and Bruce calmly added, in the last round, you'll do only one thing. Whenever you miss a hit, you'll smile. Steve almost laughed. What? Bruce repeated, smile, because a miss isn't your enemy. Your reaction is the enemy. It might have seemed childish to Steve, but it was cathartic to Bruce, because when you can smile at a miss, your ego doesn't collapse. The sparring started again, and this time Bruce slowed the pace, as if deliberately giving Steve space. But the space wasn't a gift, it was a temptation. Steve threw his first punch, missed, and tried to force a smile, but the corners of the smile were tight. Bruce noticed and immediately threw a light tag to Steve's shoulder, then cut the angle and went out. Steve threw a second punch, missed, then forced a smile, and Bruce tagged again, this time on the cheek, a soft touch, not exactly disrespectful, but clean enough to be an insult. Steve felt a micro-flare inside him, but it was still controlled. He tried to relax his jaw and then engaged again. Bruce broke the rhythm. Fast, fast, slow. And Steve's timing slipped again. Steve missed, and this time, following the rule of a smile, irritation blinked in his eyes. Bruce didn't pause for a second, just softly said, see? Steve ignored, because ignoring is also a tool of the ego, and now Steve's ego was going into survival mode. Bruce played the same trap again, guard a little low, a false opening, and Steve tried to hold himself back, but even within the hold, competition crept in. I'll hold him back. Bruce tagged Steve at exactly that moment, then out, then tag, then out, as if Bruce were saying, your control is also your costume. Steve's patience was thinning, and behind that thinning patience was something Bruce had identified all along, proving. Steve suddenly burst with pressure, a sharp step in, a heavy cross-like motion, and this was the first time the atmosphere in the room shifted, because this movement went from a lesson to a statement. Bruce didn't block. Bruce pivoted, and Steve's punch went into empty space. Steve missed, and the rule of smiling became most brutal here, because smiling after a miss is easier when you don't have insecurity. Steve didn't smile. Instead, his nostrils flared and his shoulders stiffened. Bruce raised a hand to stop the sparring, and this time his voice wasn't soft. It was firm. "Boss." Steve almost snapped. "You stop sparring over everything." Bruce said bluntly, "Yeah, because you turn everything into a fight." Steve said, "Sparring is a fight." Bruce replied, "A fight for you, a lesson for me." Steve looked at Bruce for a second, as if he were measuring the insult, then said, "So what can I do? Just keep it?" Bruce said, "No, you move, but don't make the move a proof." Steve sarcastically said, "Prove, prove, prove. You think I'm insecure?" Bruce replied simply, "I think not. I'm watching." This line was cinematic because it ended the argument, and reportedly at this point, Steve McQueen's cool genuinely cracked. He took a half step forward, clenched his jaw, and said, "Then show me." Bruce calmly said, "I'm already showing you." Steve let out an angry laugh. "No, show me what you can do." Bruce paused for a second, as if deciding how strong to make the lesson. Then he set one final condition. "Fine, but if you get angry even once, the session is over." Steve said fine, but fine contained a challenge. Sparring restarted, and this time Bruce didn't show speed. Bruce showed distance control. Every time Steve took a step, Bruce would change line. Every time Steve came close, Bruce would slip at a micro angle. And then, completely unexpected, Bruce gave Steve a clean tag on the chest, and the next second, a tag on Steve's back, as if Bruce had walked through him. Steve blinked, as if his brain had rejected reality. He turned, threw a punch, missed, and this time the miss was accompanied not by a smile, but by a hiss, that sound that comes with frustration. Bruce instantly called a stop. "Boss." Steve almost shouted, "So soon?" Bruce said, "Rule." Steve said, "I'm not angry." Bruce said, "It's not your voice that's angry, it's your body that's angry." Steve looked at his hands, his fists clenched, and for perhaps the first time, he realized that Bruce was reading his emotions in slow motion, like a video. Bruce ended the fight at this point, quite quietly, and said, "You'll learn technique, you'll learn timing, but until you can't stop winning, you won't be free even if you learn something."
A little later, Steve uttered a line that makes this story legendary. "If I stop winning, what will I be?" Bruce said without drama, "You'll be who you are, without a mask." People will continue to debate whether Steve physically lost that night, but what was reportedly unquestionable was that Steve was mentally uncomfortable. And in Hollywood, discomfort is the biggest shock, because people there mistake comfort for success. Bruce finally respected Steve, but it wasn't flattering, it was truthful. "You're strong. That's why you're finding this rule the hardest." Steve exhaled, and a look came into his eyes as if he were trying to rewrite the ending to his own story. Then he simply said, "Again." Bruce replied, "Again, when you can understand not winning." "Continue?" "And how many sections are left?" When Steve McQueen said "again," that word is normally casual in Hollywood. Take two, do it again, another shot. But in this room, again meant another confrontation, another mirror, another chance to defend his image. Bruce Lee didn't give Steve a straight no, but his yes wasn't the same as permission. Bruce's yes was like a challenge, as if he were saying, "Okay, but don't bring your habits with you this time." Steve loosened his gloves slightly, shook his shoulders, and his face took on the expression actors usually save for the camera, a mix of irritation and curiosity. Irritation because his ego was still arguing, and curiosity because Bruce had, for the first time, shown him something Steve rarely found in his world: superior control without noise.
Steve thought control was dominance, but Bruce's control was more invisible than dominance. It's something you feel but can't see, just like air. Bruce took a stance back, but the purpose of this defensive stance wasn't sparring. The purpose of the stance was to finalize the agreement. Bruce told Steve, "I won't hit you unless you promise me one thing first." Steve asked, almost suspiciously, "What?" Bruce said, "When you miss, you won't chase." Steve raised his eyebrows as if to say what kind of rule that was, but Bruce calmly added, "Chasing stiffens you. Stiffness slows you down. Slow makes you angry." Steve gave a half smile, this time for charm, as if he wanted to regain the upper hand in the negotiation. But Bruce didn't even react to that smile. Bruce simply glanced around the circle, and Steve understood that a smile wouldn't get the upper hand here. The sparring began again, and this time Steve consciously locked in his aggression. He wanted to initiate, but he didn't want to prove the initiator. This was a new muscle for Steve to use, holding the ego when the ego naturally wants to punch. Bruce gave Steve more space this time, and space meant Steve had options. Given options, one chooses one's habits. Steve threw the first punch, missed, and didn't chase. He took a micro-step back, as if respecting Bruce's rule. Bruce instantly gave him a light tap on the forehead, soft enough to be both insulting and complimenting. Steve's face changed slightly as he realized Bruce wasn't punishing Chase. Bruce was testing him for not chasing. Steve moved again, this time more patient, and Bruce tapped again. Then Bruce accompanied the tap with a single line, almost a whisper, "Good, now you're watching." Steve took a counter-step to validate that watching, and from there the tone of the fight subtly shifted. Previously, Steve's mind was asking, "How do I win?" Now his mind was asking, "What is he doing?" This shift was golden for Bruce, as curiosity temporarily mutes the ego. Bruce now kept his rhythm a little simpler. When Steve came forward, Bruce would cut the angle. When Steve paused, Bruce would pause too. And this pause was the scariest part for Steve, because in the pause you hear your heartbeat, and the heartbeat reminds you that you're human, not a legend. Steve asked Bruce honestly at one point, between breaths, "How do you always stay so calm?" Bruce didn't understand the need to stop sparring. He answered with a movement, "I'm not calm, I'm clear." Steve tried to process the line, but his processing was delayed, and Bruce tapped him again, this time on the ribs, clean and controlled. Steve didn't flinch, he accepted, but even accepting was hard for a guy like Steve, because accepting is a cousin of surrender. Bruce now revealed the final twist. He intentionally gave Steve an opening, a genuine opening, not a fake one. Steve saw the opening, and his body naturally wanted to jump. This was the exact second where the rule comes into play, and here was Steve's test. Prove it by jumping on the opening, or ignore and observe the opening. Steve ignored the opening, and Bruce instantly called stop. Steve, confused, said, "Why stop?" Bruce said, "Because you followed the rule for the first time." Steve said, almost in disbelief, "I didn't do anything." Bruce replied, "Exactly." And this exactly was the most shocking turning point in the story.
Because Steve realized that in Bruce's view, the greatest skill is not a punch, but patience. The greatest mastery is not an attack, but restraint. Steve, perhaps for the first time, experienced a moment in his life where even not doing became an achievement. Bruce deepened the conversation at this point. You've been thinking your control is your strength. Now you're realizing your restraint is your strength. Steve exhaled, and his face took on the seriousness one usually finds on a racetrack. Steve said, "But all this, in a real fight?" Bruce replied, "In a real fight, your ego gets you killed, because your ego gives you the script." Steve asked, Script? Bruce said, "Ego says, I'm the hero. I'll win. I'll dominate. Real fights don't recognize heroes." Steve absorbed this line, and then he did something that Hollywood tough guys don't usually do. He asked a question, not a challenge. "So how do I control my ego?" Bruce said, "Don't control the ego. You observe the ego. When you observe the ego, you're no longer a slave to it." Steve nodded slowly, as if he were being honest with himself for the first time. Bruce didn't exploit this honesty. Bruce ended up sparring, but finally gave a final demonstration. Bruce told Steve, "Push me once, full." Steve pushed, strong, stable. Bruce didn't resist the push. Bruce let the push flow, and Steve was thrown off balance for a second. Bruce didn't make Steve fall. Bruce caught him. The catch was the emotional punch of the story, because Bruce could have embarrassed Steve, but Bruce chose to make Steve feel safe, to let the lesson go to ego, not humiliation. Steve said quietly, almost under his breath, "I didn't expect that." Bruce replied, "You expect. That's why you're late." Steve shook his head and then took off his gloves. Taking off gloves can be a sign of defeat and also of respect. Taking off the gloves that night was a respect, but also a discomfort. Steve walked toward the distance, then stopped, and without looking back said, "This rule, I want to follow, but this rule makes me angry." Bruce said calmly, "Good. Anger is your signal." Steve asked, "Of what?" Bruce replied, "That you're stuck with your image." Steve took a deep breath, and this time there was no charm in his voice, only the truth. "How can I live without an image?" Bruce replied, "You won't live without an image. You won't make an image your boss." Steve remained silent for a few seconds, then simply said, "Okay." And when Steve McQueen said okay, it wasn't an agreement, it wasn't a surrender, it was the start of a struggle that makes this story more of a psychological duel than a sparring session. Continue? Bruce Lee didn't interrupt Steve McQueen with an okay lecture, because Bruce knew that when someone first notices their own ego, too many words drown that notice. Bruce simply dimmed the room lights, let the air settle, and gave Steve that silence where you can't lie to yourself. Steve put his hand on the door handle, then stopped and looked behind, as if something inside him was still fighting, not with Bruce, not with technique, with his own cool mask. Steve asked almost quietly, "If I follow this rule, what will I become?" Bruce said without hesitation, "You won't become faster, you'll become safer." Steve found this answer strange, because stars worship speed and power, not safety. Bruce sensed the confusion and added, "Safety means freedom. Freedom means your mind is not your enemy." Steve took a deep breath, and a look came over his face as if he were thinking of rewriting the script of his own life. Then he laughed. The ending of that night wasn't dramatic, no knockout, no crowd reaction, but the story's weight lay in its simplicity, because what happened to Steve doesn't leave a mark on the body, it leaves a mark on the identity. Over the next few days, Hollywood returned to its routine, sets, meetings, parties, scripts, but a subtle change had occurred within Steve. The change wasn't overt, it was in his decisions. People say Steve normally commanded every situation, but now he started pausing at certain moments, and pausing was strange for a guy like Steve McQueen, because pausing meant he wasn't obeying his reflexes. Bruce's sparring rule stuck with Steve like a sentence: no ego, no proving. Whenever Steve felt himself growing angry, whenever he tried to project dominance in a room, Bruce's voice would ring in the back of his mind. You turned the rule into a trophy, and the word trophy stung Steve, because for him, life was a trophy chase: better roles, faster cars, bigger respect. Bruce had turned the trophy chase into a villain. So for Steve, this lesson wasn't just about martial arts, it became personal. Some say Steve later had more sessions with Bruce, and in each session Bruce repeated the same thing: temperament before technique. But Bruce's obsession was always one thing: your reaction. For Bruce, reaction is your reality. If you get angry at a miss, your mind is controlling you. If you panic after being hit, your ego is driving you. If you stay calm and observe, you are free. The concept of freedom was new to Steve because his entire public persona was an act of freedom. Motorcycles, desert roads, rebellious vibe. But Bruce showed him that real freedom lies not on the road, but within the nervous system. Steve understood, perhaps for the first time, that being cool and being free were not the same thing. Cool was a mask, free was reality. This is where the legacy part of the story begins, because the link between Bruce Lee and Steve McQueen wasn't just a rumor, it became a turning point in Hollywood martial arts culture. Bruce already had a circle of confidants, actors, athletes, producers, who considered him not just a trainer, but a secret weapon. Having a star like Steve McQueen come to Bruce's attention and then attaching a rule that challenged cool deepened Bruce's mystique. People kept saying, Bruce isn't just fast, Bruce is psychologically dangerous. And in Hollywood, people are both attracted and afraid of psychologically dangerous people. This story elevated Bruce Lee from a martial arts instructor to a mindset teacher. And for Steve McQueen, this encounter became a hidden badge. In public, he was still the king of cool, but privately, he had a memory that didn't comfort his confidence, it sharpened it. Then comes the part of time that makes every Bruce Lee story bittersweet. After Bruce Lee's death, the world plastered his philosophy on posters, created quotes, and made merch. But those who knew him closely knew that Bruce's real gift wasn't his kicks. His gift was the uncomfortable truth he awakens within you. Bruce's gift was the same for Steve McQueen. This gift isn't glamorous, so it's underappreciated in mainstream interviews. But whenever insiders talk about Bruce, one thing keeps repeating. Bruce made you face yourself. And the face yourself thing scares celebrities the most, because in celebrity life, you face people, not yourself. Bruce introduced Steve to himself. The final philosophical takeaway from this story is simple, in Bruce Lee's style, but within this simplicity lies a blade. Bruce's sparring rule isn't just a rule of sparring, it's a rule of life. When you start defending your image, you stop learning. When you make winning an addiction, you ignore the truth. Bruce used to say, the goal of a fight isn't to dominate your opponent, but to master yourself. Whether Steve McQueen understood this or not, only Steve knows. But it's clear that Bruce didn't physically hurt Steve in that room. Bruce scratched his identity. And after the identity gets scratched, a person can do two things. Either he can tighten his mask more, or he can become a little free. If you apply this story to your own life, Bruce's message doesn't become boring motivation, it becomes practical. Whenever you feel I must win in any situation, be it an argument, a competition, a relationship, that's the moment you lose your reality. Winning is just the outcome. Control is your choice. And Bruce Lee's point was that you have choice only when ego isn't your boss. If even someone like Steve McQueen struggled with that rule, that struggle is normal, but it's also proof that the rules are real. Because fake rules seem easy, real rules make you uncomfortable. Bruce Lee made Steve uncomfortable that night, and perhaps that's why the story lives on decades later.